Because communism and capitalism are polar opposites, also because communism in both of these places will occur because of revolutionary activity, it's kind of going to be a no-brainer that there is going to be a conflict between the Eastern communist forces and the Western capitalist forces. And Europe is going to be the Cold War's first arena. Concern for security and control in Eastern Europe versus the British and American desire for open societies linked to the capitalist world economy is going to be the initial sticking point. I mean, everyone in the immediate aftermath of World War II kind of figured that the relationship between the communist East and the Allied capitalist West was going to fall apart. But no one kind of betted that it was going to fall apart quite this quickly. And ultimately, with the creation of the rival military alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the American sphere of influence, Western Europe, is largely going to be voluntary. The Soviet sphere of Eastern Europe is going to be imposed because if you remember, I said this earlier in the chapter, Stalin's tanks are in Eastern Europe. He pulls the e-brake and he says, "Hey, you know what? I'm taking this as payment, uh, or as response to the brutalization that Russia occurred with World War One and also World War Two." And then ultimately, this figurative iron curtain is going to divide the two spheres. You want to put down here two things. One next to B underneath number two. You want to put down this is where the Russians, this is where the Russians were at the end of World War Two. This is where the Russians were at the end of World War Two. And then in C, underneath number two, you want to underline Iron Curtain and just draw a little arrow over to the side. You want to put down that this was a term coined by Winston Churchill. Eventually, communism is going to spread to Asia, China, Korea, Vietnam, those places. And this is going to cause conflict where we have the North Koreans invading South Korea in 1950. And then, of course, in the 1960s, you have Vietnam and the massive US intervention in that area. Um, Although you want to put down here next to B underneath number three, and I think that we'll talk a little bit about this in a later chapter. But you want to put, please, here that this started out as an imperial issue, and then also add to that that the Vietnamese communists successfully united the country by 1975. Vietnam, by the way, had previously been French Indochina, and in the 1950s, late 1940s, 1950s, the French are desperately trying to hold on, and the Vietnamese, led by communists, are going to try to, and led by others as well, are going to simply try to get out of French control once the communists are, looking as though they're taking a little bit more of an assertive stance, and it looks as though that they're winning, and they're going to control Vietnam, and who knows, perhaps Laos and Cambodia as well, then the United States, goes and pops in. And it's something that we'll deal with here a little bit later as well. We ultimately here are also going to have a major Cold War conflict in Afghanistan as well, where a Marxist party takes power in 1978, but soon alienated much of the population. To try to deal with the fact that the Afghanis aren't necessarily real warm and fuzzy over the Soviets coming in, the Soviets are going to get bogged into a massive military intervention for the better part of 10 years, and they really meet with very little success. Eventually, here the Soviet Union withdraws in 1989 under international pressure, and communist rule of Afghanistan is going to collapse. What I need you to put down here next to C underneath number 4. Do you want to put please here? It's sort of kind of like two notes. We're just gonna run it into one. Do you want to put that this helps to bring an end to the Soviet Union? This helps to bring an end to the Soviet Union. It also brings the Taliban, Taliban, into Afghanistan. The United States actually goes and supports the Mujahideen, who will eventually kind of morph their way into the Taliban as an effort to get rid of the communists within Afghanistan. In fact, there's a couple issues where once the with the Olympics, um, the Soviet Union goes and invades Afghanistan, and in response to that, the United States boycotts the 1980 Olympics. In response to the boycott of the 1980 Olympics, the Soviet Union will boycott the London Olympics in 1984 as well. There was also a situation that could have become very, very heated between these two Cold War powerhouses, but ultimately never happened. And that's going to be a situation in Cuba when Fidel Castro comes to power in 1959. Ultimately, here, one of the reasons why the Cold War never gets truly heated is going to be the simple fact that eventually both of these two superpowers are going to pretty much be at a nuclear standoff. When the Soviet Union succeeds in creating a nuclear weapon in 1949, this is going to ultimately lead to a massive arms race, where by 1989, the world had nearly 60,000 nuclear warheads with very complex delivery systems. Another kind of unique thing with this, you want to put this down here next to number 2 underneath capital B, you want to put down that this helps to weaken the Soviet Union. This helps to weaken the Soviet Union. The problem with the Soviet Union is at base, they never truly deal with the deep seated economic problems that honestly still carry over from prior to the Russian Revolution. There are like these deep seated economic problems that plague the Russian Empire that really Lenin, Stalin, any of the other communist leaders really don't necessarily deal with. And what they end up doing is, in order to just try to keep up with the United States in a bunch of different things, but especially in the arms race, they kind of overspend they overspend beyond what their economy has the capacity to do. So this, coupled with the war in Afghanistan, coupled with the space race, and just an overall weak economy, is going to be one of the many things that kind of will help to bring down the Soviet Union. One of the reasons why we never completely go to a hot war, that we stay at a cold war, is that both the Soviet Union and the United States knew how serious their destructive power was. So instead, we kind of have this passive aggressive conflict where both the US and the Soviet Union are courting third world countries. Sometimes because of this, the United States often supported corrupt and authoritarian regimes. I mean, we don't necessarily pick our friends real well. And some of these countries, and this is kind of like the genius, because a lot of these areas, and again, we'll deal with this next chapter, are just coming out of imperialism, just coming out of their colonial experience with a European power. And so they're in need of some things and some money and some advisors and, just whatever. And some of these developing worlds are going to play the superpowers off against each other. Like, they'll gravitate towards the United States because the United States is paying some bills, and then as soon as that funding goes and vanishes, then they'll start look as though they're flirting with the Soviet Union to try to engage US dollars or to try to get even a better deal from the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the United States is going to become the leader of the West against communism. And, again, one of the things that we talked about last chapter is that there's this massive power void by the middle of the 20th century. If you think about the top five powers prior to World War II, it's going to be the United States, it's England, it's France, it's Germany, and maybe Japan thrown in there, but it's also going to be Russia. Well, if you look at in the aftermath of World War II, the only two countries that are still standing in any type of meaningful way is going to be the United States and the Soviet Union. So because the United States is a, Western capitalist power, all of those other former capitalist powerhouses like France, Germany, and Japan are going to gravitate towards the United States. This is going to ultimately lead to a creation of a quote unquote imperial presidency in the United States, where we're not necessarily imperializing in the same way that we saw in the 19th century, but instead we're imperializing through culture, through currency, through trade in a lot of ways. And this is also going to help to strengthen the influence of the military industrial complex. The United States, one of the reasons why we have such solid employment for the years immediately following World War II is not simply because we're helping our Western allies rebuild after the devastation, but we also have to prepare for what we see, what we think, what maybe we even believe is going to be an ultimate throwdown with the Soviet Union. You do want to put down here, so you're not confused by this. You do want to put down here next to C underneath number one. You want to put down that this was to fight the communists. This was to fight the communists. And like I said, this U.S. military effort was sustained by a flourishing economy and an increasingly middle class society. The United States has a stable economy and is able to support this type of spending that is going to go on. Where the Soviets are going to try to do the exact same thing, but they don't have an economy that's strong enough. One of the major advantages that the United States has, and this is not one that any of the other Western powers, and this is definitely not one that the Soviet Union has, is that the United States industry had not been harmed by World War II, unlike any of the other major industrial societies. I mean, all the other major industrial societies had been devastated or destroyed by World War II. The United States had not. So all of the necessary materials in order to rebuild Western Europe is going to be coming through the United States. So there's a lot of wealth kind of being circulated there. And one of the other ways, or the main way, that the United States is going to look as though it's an imperial power is through the spread of American popular culture around the world. In fact, you want to put down here next to number three. You want to put down that this is how the US is seen as imperialist, and then put imperialist in quotes. I mean, just to give you an idea here, around 33,000 McDonald's restaurants are going to be found in 119 countries, and that's, in 2012. That's, more than 10 years ago. Eventually here we're going to have a little bit of a chilling out, although it will be fleeting. And this is going to be done by Nikita Khrushchev, who takes power after Stalin's death in 1953. 3 years later, he denounces Stalin as a criminal. And this is going to be a little bit of a chilling out period. So you want to put a little star here by number four. As the Cold War justifies a continuing Soviet emphasis on military and defense industries. And you want to put down here next to five, just real quick, same as the US. Same as the US. I mean, they're going to claim that a US invasion or a US provoked war is going to be inevitable and that they need to prepare. Again, the exact opposite of what the United States is preparing for. The United States is preparing for what they see to be an inevitable strike by the communists, sorry, by the Soviets. So they need to prepare. What you also are starting to see here in the aftermath of the death of Stalin, and then throughout the 60s and 70s and also into the 80s, is that there's a growing conflict among communist countries. The first one here is going to be that Yugoslavia is going to reject Soviet domination. Now, this is really, really brave because this is actually going to be done while Stalin is still alive. And the key figure here, and you want to put down here next to A, underneath number 6, you want to put down that this was under the leadership of Tito, Tito, the best name ever of a communist leader. Tito basically goes and tells Stalin to shove it. I mean, the guy had a backbone. I mean, Stalin's at his height, and Tito goes, "Yeah, no, we're not going to listen to you." Surprisingly, doesn't get much in the way of the wrath of Stalin, which I kind of find, unbelievable. We also have some Soviet invasion of Hungary in the 1950s and and Czechoslovakia in the late 1960s that crushed reform movements. In both of these places, you have these rebellions that attempt to overthrow and to get rid of the communist regimes there. There also ends up being sharp opposition between the Soviet Union and also China. You want to put down here next to E, and this is kind of a medium-ish size note, but you want to put down here next to E underneath number 6. Do you want to put, please, that they have ideological differences? They have ideological differences, rivalry for communist leadership, and then add to that in 1960, the Soviet Union withdrew Soviet advisors and technicians from China. Ultimately, here, world communism is going to reach its greatest extent in the 1970s. In fact, you want to go ahead and put a little star here by number 7. In the 1970s, by the late 1970s, you're actually going to start to see the communist world shrink. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit here in the next section.